A suspected Islamic State bomb attack in rebel-held Syria. At least 43 people, mostly civilians, have been killed. Good evening. A fuel tanker has exploded outside a courthouse and market in the Syrian town of Azaz, near the Turkish border. As well as the 43 dead, dozens more are injured. The area is controlled by Free Syrian Army rebels who recently pushed out extremist Islamic State militants. They want it back and are being blamed for the attack. Also tonight, is there a humanitarian crisis in the NHS? The head of the British Red Cross tells us why he thinks there is. Is the free press under attack or crying wolf? Newspapers step up their campaign to stop a new punitive regime for those who reject the state-sanctioned complaint system. And could it hail a new generation of Paralympic heroes? Disabled children will now get special prosthetics for sport on the NHS. At least 43 people have been killed and many more injured when a fuel truck bomb exploded in a busy Syrian market. Witnesses said the blast was so powerful that bodies were strewn on the ground as panicked crowds tried to flee. The device went off in the rebel-held town of Azaz in Aleppo province, just near the Turkish border. A warning, there are graphic images of the attack from the start of this report by Jane Dodge.
As children run for their lives and two men try to drag another to safety, falling debris smashes onto the pavement. Then a man emerges from the smoke. His clothes are on fire, but he doesn't stop, discarding his burning jacket as he continues to run. Another injured survivor stumbles from the scene. These pictures were filmed by an activist in Azaz just moments after a massive bomb packed into a fuel tanker exploded outside the town's courthouse. Most of those killed were civilians, some of them lawyers and judges.
As you can see, the explosion targeted the court in Azaz, and the explosion took place a few meters from the entrance to the court. We see smoke continuing to rise and the bodies of civilians on the ground. This crime can only have been committed by the terrorist Islamic State organization that targets civilians and those who build this country.
Azaz is a major stronghold of the Turkish-backed Free Syrian Army, and some of its rebel fighters also died. Thousands of people fleeing the violence in Aleppo have settled here. But today it proved anything but a safe haven.
A large number of bodies have come to us, 20 so far. We've also received lots of injured people, all of them from the terrorist bombing.
People thanked God as one man was rescued from the rubble of a building. Some of the injured were taken across the border to a hospital in Kilis in Turkey. Turkish and Kurdish news agencies are blaming the so-called Islamic State for the bombing, but so far no group has claimed responsibility. IS has tried to take the town several times since it originally held Azaz in 2013. The attack comes a day after Russia's carrier fleet set course for home, the start, supposedly, of a withdrawal of its military forces in Syria. It's the worst such bombing since the start of a nationwide ceasefire, brokered by Russia and Turkey. IS is not included in the truce.
Overcrowding in England's hospital waiting rooms has become a humanitarian crisis, according to the Red Cross, which is blaming cuts in government funding for putting the health service under impossible strain. Latest figures show A&E departments shut their doors to patients more than 140 times last month. NHS chiefs say the Red Cross, which gets called in to help take patients home from hospital and free up beds, is exaggerating.
No, it's not in crisis. The NHS is not in crisis. We have a very comprehensive escalation plan which uses the whole of the local economy, for the local authority, for the hospitals, for the ambulance service, for GPs, to step up when the hospitals get into difficulty.
Well, earlier I spoke to the Chief Executive of the British Red Cross, Mike Adamson, and I asked him what he meant by humanitarian crisis in our hospitals.
Well, the definition of a humanitarian crisis is when you have large numbers of people at some kind of threat to their health or well-being. And actually, 500,000 people who used to get social care support no longer do, and by most estimates there's more than 1 million people who would benefit from social care support now who need it. And as the situation that we see in people's homes is more and more chaotic. When our volunteers get into the home, what they can often find, there is not only is there no food in the fridge, but food hasn't been cleared up, bills haven't been paid for several months. You can even have toileting issues and so on. And actually, the complexity of the situations our volunteers are dealing with are getting greater and greater. And if you think about it from the perspective of someone who's waiting on a trolley bed in an A&E department, and everybody working very hard around them, but actually, if you're on your own, you're waiting for several hours, you don't know what's going to happen next, it's inevitable that you will feel very vulnerable, and that is a crisis for you. And in that sense, every crisis is personal, and there are a lot of people who are having that experience at the moment.
But words really matter because they've been turned into headlines and they're being bandied around. And, I've been to humanitarian crises around the world, and I'm sure you have, and they're generally wars and earthquakes and disasters and people in really desperate straits. And there's a worry that you've devalued the phrase humanitarian crisis by applying it here.
We haven't devalued the phrase. I mean, what we've got is a human crisis at scale. And, I absolutely recognise the situations you describe around the world. I mean, the Red Cross is at the heart of supporting people in those crises as well. But when we look at what we're seeing here, we have a human crisis that is happening at scale. And actually, it's our job to share the experience of what we observe in our services, but then also just listen to the evidence from some of the very reputable organisations commenting on the pressures that the NHS is operating under and social care is operating under. And the thing is, it doesn't necessarily need to be this way. In a 21st century developed country, surely we can do more.
Can I finally then just clarify this bit? Because I think what's happened is we're in the middle of a winter crisis and there are problems going on in A&E, and so the idea of the Red Cross in the NHS has been very alarming. It doesn't seem to me that you're saying that there is a humanitarian crisis in British hospitals. You're saying there is a crisis in social care. Am I right?
I'm saying the thing about it is that it's the same people. It's the same people who are in our hospitals and or then not getting the support they need at home. And the system is interdependent, and we need more investment in social care and support in the community. There is no doubt about that. But we also need to make provide some of the services within hospitals to help those people get home faster.
Mike Adamson, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
The US President-elect Donald Trump has been back on Twitter again, declaring that only stupid people or fools would think that having close ties with Russia was a bad thing. The series of tweets by Mr. Trump come a day after he was given an intelligence briefing saying that Russia had tried to influence the US election to help him win. He's repeatedly questioned whether the intelligence claims are true. A campaign group that uses music, film and radio talk shows to spread awareness about girls' rights in Ethiopia has lost its British aid funding. Girl Effect created a 5-piece girl band called Yenya as part of its campaign against forced marriage, violence and barriers to girls' education. The decision follows a press campaign which dubbed Yenya the Ethiopian Spice Girls. The Department for International Development said empowering women remained a priority, but there were more effective ways of investing millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Jane Deeth reports.
Yenya. It takes 5 women and the power of the media to try to lift up Ethiopia's girls.
Yenya. It means ours in Amharic. Because to change things here, for girls, you have to speak to everyone.
Everyone.
That's why each week we produce,
edit
and star in a radio drama and talk show.
The UK government, which was helping fund them, said it was about changing society's perceptions of girls, letting them stay at school, fighting forced marriage and domestic violence. But the Daily Mail and the Telegraph branded them Ethiopia's Spice Girls, a waste of taxpayers' money. Now, the Department for International Development, which gave the project an A grade in evaluations, is leaving the band, saying there are more effective ways to invest.
In the end, the media win, because who is going to lose out? The people that need the money the most. And I think we need to go back to that and look at the inspiration that this young group were doing, were able to reach, and Media cannot dictate that, and DFID should not, hopefully, have not conceded to that.
Yenya isn't just a girl band, it's a drama series, a talk show and a schools programme. Today they said the project had been misrepresented and the funding was a hand up, not a handout. But in total, DFID spent £4.6 million on Yenya. In a year, around 3 million people listen to their radio shows or watch their music videos. And 76% of girls who've engaged say it's convinced them to stay at school. But the UK aid spending watchdog isn't convinced. Its first independent review said there was a lack of clarity around the goals and accountability. And the second review urged the government to consider in depth whether ongoing funding is merited. Now, £7 million of future funding will go elsewhere. The UK's total foreign aid budget is £12.1 billion. Critics say DFID has more money than it can sensibly handle.
There's a massive incentive to spend the money, and come the end of the year, people are basically throwing it out of the door to get it out. You're also going to get bad projects because there's not enough scrutiny and not enough transparency, and that's why it's a good thing that DFID is monitored by newspapers like the Daily Mail.
Is this a victory for those who say charity begins at home? The UK's legally bound to spend the £12 billion abroad. But there's speculation the government could go back on that promise after the next election.
Now, phone hacking, intrusion, bullying and smears. More than 5 years after this kind of shocking behaviour by some of Britain's most popular newspapers was exposed, the Leveson inquiry has already led to new, tougher regulations. But the fierce debate over press freedom versus responsibility rages on. And on Tuesday, the government will end its consultation over what more needs to be done. Our Home Affairs correspondent Andy Davis reports.
Remember this?
She's picked up her voicemails, Bob. She's alive. And I was just... It was then, really.
I felt such a sense of invasion.
If you take away the cameras, what have you got? You've got a pack of men chasing a woman, and obviously that's a very intimidating situation to be in.
Leveson Inquiry Part 1, where witness after witness, more than 300 were called, and where a judge eventually gave his damning verdict on past injustices, as he put it, perpetrated by the press. Private lives treated as commodities, truth and dignity sacrificed in pursuit of stories. It's been 4 years since it ended. Numerous criminal trials followed, but there are matters still outstanding, which the government put recently to a public consultation. Such as Leveson Part 2, the section of the inquiry meant to examine relationships between the press and the police. After all this time, after all the criminal trials, is it still worth going ahead with this, is the question. And then there's something called Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act, to introduce it or not. Many in the newspaper industry are vehemently opposed to it. Section 40 was designed as a way to encourage the press to sign up to a new post-Leveson regulatory body recognised under Royal Charter. Because if a newspaper chooses not to join that approved body, if Section 40 was brought in, then in libel cases, for instance, the paper would have to pay all legal costs, even those incurred by a complainant who loses against them.
For some courses it starts up next week, others...
Punitive, yes, but justified, according to this media academic who explains the thinking behind it.
The idea was that they didn't want to deter people who don't have the money to maybe take on a large newspaper with all the costs involved. They might be worried that I can't possibly take on the Daily Mail or whoever it is because I don't have the money to pay the legal bills. But if they know they won't have to pay those costs, they're more likely to take that complaint forward. That was why it was created like that.
But in the industry, it's seen very differently indeed. The Daily Mail has called it an appalling piece of legislation. The Telegraph has declared the most profound impact would be on the health of our democracy itself, while the Metro claims Section 40 would leave nobody to expose scandals ranging from the Rotherham sex grooming cover-up to MPs' expenses. Media Wales, owned by the Trinity Mirror Group, publishes several titles in Wales. Like most of the industry, they refuse to sign up to the Royal Charter recognised regulator, preferring instead the press-funded rival body called Ipso. Why, I asked their editor-in-chief, do they consider Section 40 such a threat?
The most terrifying thing is the chilling effect, because in real terms, what would happen would be we would not be able to publish the type of, well, in a headline sense, the type of public interest journalism that I'm sure everybody agrees that we should do, you know, exposing corruption.
Why not?
Because those people who we were targeting legitimately and in the public interest would be able to threaten us with a libel action that would cost us so much money to fight successfully that we just wouldn't be able to publish.
Well, the solution to that is that you sign up to the recognised regulator and then you won't have to pay these prohibitive costs.
No, but we don't see why we should be forced to do that.
And many in his industry share that view. Press regulation, Leveson Part 2, as the government's consultation nears a conclusion next week. Voices on either side of this enduring debate grow louder.
Well, earlier I spoke to the journalist Peter Jukes, who supports the campaign for greater press regulation, and Rachel Jolly from Index on Censorship, who promote free expression worldwide and monitor threats to free speech. And I began by asking Peter Jukes why he thought it was fair that publications would have to pay the legal costs of someone who is guilty of what they've been accused of.
It would be completely unfair if that was even half the story. That's a third of the story. Basically, if you avoid low-cost arbitration, which is a Leveson system, and you go to court, you have to pay for the luxury of it. So all of this is encouraging low-cost arbitration, access to justice for victims of press abuses.
If you sign up to the state body?
No, it's not. There's no state body. If you sign up to an independent regulator, the regulation is to protect against state interference and commercial interference.
Rachel, how independent do you see this alternative regulator that Peter Jukes is part of?
Index has a long history of opposing state involvement, government involvement in the media and media freedom. And what we see here is the politicians being too close and controlling press freedom in this form. And we're not happy to join IPSO, and we're certainly not happy to join Impress.
Why not?
Which is state approved. I mean, we feel that, you know, it's basically giving politicians too much control over the media.
The press sounds like it's being terribly principled and independent and trying to push away political interference, when the truth is it's also trying to stop victims of their excesses having low-cost, fair access to justice.
I think at the heart of this is actually that this is just a bizarre rule, isn't it? If it was happening anywhere else in the world, British politicians would be outraged. The idea that you can publish a story, your local newspaper, that, say, the Maidenhead Advertiser could publish a story about, say, a care home and how it's abusing people within it. And that care home company could take the local newspaper to court and make them pay the cost.
But that's because you're choosing not to go along with what was set up after this long, drawn-out, very expensive inquiry, in which everybody gave evidence and it ended up with a system.
If you choose to not join this state-approved regulator, which basically thousands of newspapers and magazines and publishers have chosen not to do. I mean, it's a bizarre-sounding set of regulations, and, you know, if it was going on in any other place in the world, we would look at it with outrage.
It's going on in Ireland, and their press freedom index has gone up. It goes on in Finland. It's just low-cost arbitration.
You seem to have forgotten all those victims who we heard during the Leveson process.
No, not at all. And we're in favour of a low-cost arbitration scheme, not one that, and we think one that should be open to every newspaper publication, whether it's Private Eye, whether it's The Guardian, whether it's the FT, whether it's the Daily Mirror. That it shouldn't be regulated by joining this organisation, which is state-approved.
So you just have what you have at the moment, but you take away the statutory
and this is
element.
Not what Leveson had in mind. He did not have in mind this. He had in mind a regulator that the majority of the press would join. This is not that.
But Leveson recognised you need an incentive. No newspaper is going to give up that power to a monster to mark its own homework unless there's a carrot and a stick. And I'd happily hear another stick. You know, if Rachel could tell me another way to make Murdoch and Dacre and Desmond listen to it, actually correct properly, I'd go along with it.
I think the point here is that we are against state control. We are against politicians getting too close to the media. And in effect, what you're doing is handing politicians the opportunity to control the press.
How? It is triple locked. against any political interference, the recognition panel is appointed more separately than the judiciary is, and it would take 2/3 majority in the House of Lords, House of Commons and the Scottish Assembly to overturn its remit as make sure that a regulator is free from commercial and political power. Now, of course, there's always a danger of state control. You have the IP bill, but that's every day, and that's just on a simple majority they can overturn our press freedom. This is one, in the Royal Charter is one of the more protected forms. In fact, the press came up with the idea of the Royal Charter because it had very little political interference.
Journalists around the country are against joining this organisation.
No, NUJ is for it.
Local newspaper editors, from the Maidenhead Advertiser to the Nottingham Post, really fear that this kind of financial pressure could push them over the edge. Local newspapers are already under enormous financial pressure. Many of them are doing an absolutely excellent job bringing stories out that nobody else is covering. Do you really want those newspapers to close? At the same time,
of course not.
This legislation does nothing to look at what's happening on the web, which is, you know, a massive part of what's happening in the world of journalism right now.
So that's quite a big point, isn't it? That you know, the world has overtaken this regulatory system. And what is the point of having these big structures that don't affect the vast majority of what people are now reading?
Look, here's the thing. You know, coal mining's declining, just like the paper's declining. We don't suddenly say, well, there's no regulation needed in coal mining, children can go down the mines. This idea of fake news is a huge problem. This idea of accuracy, this idea of arbitration and avoiding the courts is very relevant to the online world. It sets a precedent.
Peter Jukes and Rachel Jolly talking to me earlier. Now, the 26-year-old Iraq war veteran who's suspected of shooting 5 people dead at Fort Lauderdale Airport in Florida chose to travel there specifically to carry out his rampage, according to officials. Florida's governor said some of the victims were still fighting for their lives in hospital after Friday's mass shooting in the crowded baggage claim area. Detectives say the suspect, Esteban Santiago, cooperated with investigators who interviewed him for several hours overnight. Football now, and Wayne Rooney has equalled Manchester United's goal-scoring record after a 4-0 FA Cup victory over Reading. Rooney draws level with the United legend Sir Bobby Charlton on 249 goals and could break the record in the League Cup on Tuesday. Jack Taylor reports.
A striker on the verge of history. Wayne Rooney has waited all his career to equal Sir Bobby Charlton's goal-scoring record, and after just 6 minutes, the wait was over. Yes, there it is! Even the man whose record Rooney was set to break joined the applause. Amid the history-making, there was an FA Cup tie to be won. Anthony Martial made it 2-0.
That's 2-0, it was too easy, really, to Rashford.
After equalling Sir Bobby's United record, Rooney now tried to break it, but despite several chances, it was a stretch too far. There were no such problems for United's next generation. Teenager Marcus Rashford made it 3-0. And after a terrible mistake by Reading's goalkeeper, Rashford scored his second. A record equalled, Rooney may have a chance on Tuesday to become United's highest goal scorer. Final score, Manchester United 4, Reading 0.
Preston North End and Arsenal are currently playing in the evening kick-off. Preston took the lead after 6 minutes at Deepdale before Arsenal equalised with a powerful shot early in the second half. With the match in injury time, the score is now Preston North End 1, Arsenal 2. In a selection of today's other matches, League One Millwall beat Premier League Bournemouth, Bolton drew with Premier League Crystal Palace, Championship side Wolves knocked out Stoke, Derby beat Premier League West Brom, non-league Lincoln drew with Ipswich, but Stourbridge, the lowest ranked side left in the competition, were knocked out by Wycombe. Tennis, and Novak Djokovic has beaten Sir Andy Murray in the final of the Qatar Open. Murray saved 3 match points before losing by 2-1 in an exciting match in Doha. Both men are preparing for the Australian Open, which begins later this month. Now, it could help to create a new generation of Paralympians. Prosthetic limbs are being offered to children who are missing an arm or leg, thanks to a £1.5 million fund from the NHS. The cash is paying for a range of special equipment, from running blades to arm attachments, helping every child get the chance to participate in sport, as our sports reporter, Jordan Jarrett-Bryan, has been finding out.
I mean, I've got spikes on the bottom of mine to start with, The cost of this prosthetic blade can range from anywhere between £10,000 and £17,000. Paralympic sprinter Julie Rogers, like most athletes, was fortunate enough to receive hers through the manufacturers and sponsorship.
I was really lucky to sort of be identified for my potential, if you like, and I got given the blade. And yeah, I mean, it just made such a difference.
But today the government has introduced a scheme where young amputees can receive a similar prosthetic on the NHS.
Right, how have you been doing then since you've had your blade?
A £1.5 million fund by the Department of Health means that children across England are eligible for running and swimming blades. The move was introduced by Health Secretary Jeremy Hunt during last summer's Paralympic Games in Rio, with the first children now benefiting from the new prosthesis. Like 13-year-old Ben Moore, who had his foot amputated aged 10. Ben was fitted with an artificial leg, which he says was fine for everyday use, but didn't match his sporting ambitions.
I used to not be able to be able to run as fast or able to kick a ball as well, but now I've got a good amount of power in my leg and I've got the right size.
The scheme is open to anyone under 17, with just over 1,000 child patients who are lower limb amputees. The Department of Health are anticipating they could help several hundred children a year with this project.
I genuinely think that the best place to invest this kind of money in it is people that genuinely value, they just want to go for a run. It can be people that have great aspirations, that want to train really hard, or it could be people that just want to go for a run around the park with their dog.
It's only been months since Paralympic GB completed their most successful medal haul at last year's Games in Rio. But today's announcement from the government aims to not only ensure that more young people are keeping active, but it might just produce the next generation of Paralympic sprinters. The initiative is primarily to produce a healthier generation of young people, but who knows what future stars may come out as a result.
Tonight's main news: at least 43 people have been killed in a rebel-held Syrian town near the Turkish border after a rigged fuel truck exploded near a busy market. Almost 100 other people were wounded. We're back tomorrow at 6:15. Until then, that's Channel 4 News. Have a very good evening.